Hey guys! As many of you know, I'm a big fan of going through and drawing out processes. I believe that this is one of the best ways that you can use to come along and learn some of the material that we've covered in this class, especially things like the processes. So what I'm going to do right now is take a brief moment to draw some of these out on a whiteboard so that you can go through and draw these out alongside me and do those on your own. The more you draw these out and the more you practice these pathways, then the greater chance you'll have at remembering them. So go through and follow along as we look at the main functions of the neuron. Okay, so we can imagine first an action potential as a charge across a membrane. That action potential is going to occur across the axonal lemma, otherwise known as the cell membrane at the axon. The first thing we want to think about here is going to be what's going on at resting potential. At resting potential, we're going to have a series of ion channels we need to think about. The first of these is going to be the sodium-potassium pump. That sodium-potassium pump will let first sodium that's inside the cell will pump it out, while at the same time taking potassium that's outside the cell and pump it in. As a result, we have a high concentration of potassium inside the cell and a high concentration of sodium outside the cell. Now, we also then have leak channels. Those additional leak channels will allow potassium to move across its gradient. As they do so, they will leave negatively charged ions behind and take their positive charge with them. As a result, you have a positive charge on the outside and a minus charge on the inside. At resting potential, that happens to about minus 70 millivolts. At about minus 70 millivolts, it'll come to an equilibrium. This is because you have the potassiums, which will push it down to about minus 90, but occasionally you'll have a sodium channel here and there. That will allow some sodiums through, that will start to cancel out a little bit of that charge. That brings us to our initial depolarization. The initial depolarization occurs when additional amounts of sodium move into a region of the cell. As they do that, they begin to cancel out some of these negative charges. As they cancel those out, they create what we refer to as an initial depolarization, or the membrane becomes slightly less polarized. If that happens, that can bring this minus 70 up to minus 55. Minus 55 becomes the threshold potential for our voltage gated sodium channels. That allows us high concentration of sodium that's outside the cell to come pouring in. As they become pouring in, they definitely cancel out much of that negative charge. As a result, you have the rising limb. However, those then very quickly clog, while at the same time you have potassium voltage-gated channels which are now open. Those voltage-gated potassium channels will allow potassium to flow freely. Now we have those potassium voltage-gated channels that are open, plus we still have those leak channels that are open. As a result, the membrane is now even more permeable to potassium than it was before. As a result, that charge then gets reestablished, but then overdoes it and overshoots down to a hyperpolarization. However, at that point, the potassium channels then clog. At that point, the sodium voltage-gated channels are clogged. The potassium voltage-gated channels are clogged. However, you still have potassium and sodium moving across through the leak channels, and that'll bring us back to the resting potential. Now, as we're doing that, we can think about this as a series of steps. Step 1 is going to be that initial resting period and that resting potential. Step 2 will be that influx of sodium. Step 3 is going to be the opening of the sodium voltage-gated channels. Step 4 is the opening of the potassium voltage-gated channels. And step 5 is going to be that refractory period. So if we're viewing this all in one spot, we can view this as a 5-step approach. But really what's going on within a cell is that this will occur at a location, but that action will get conducted down a neuron. That conduction will happen as you have initially an amount of sodium that comes in, causing a depolarization, allowing additional sodium to enter. That creates locally a high concentration of sodium, which can then diffuse down the length of the axon. Now, at that place, we then have the completion of the action potential. But that sodium that just came in can diffuse slightly down, causing an influx of sodium. Of course, the action potential is going to continue on there, but we still have this high concentration now of sodium that can diffuse down the axon a little bit further. As we have that sodium move down, it can then create the next action potential. As a result, as we move down, we have this wave of sodium moving across the membrane, causing a depolarization, causing a wave of the action potential moving across the length of the axon. This would happen in unmyelinated sheaths or unmyelinated axons. Those with a myelinated sheath will move through the process of sartorial conduction. That sartorial conduction will only happen at portions of the axon that are not being covered by Schwann cells or by oligodendrocytes, in which case our little sodium influx will happen here and then have to diffuse over to the next node of Revenir where more sodium can come in and diffuse to the next one, and diffuse to the next one. This jumping action from node of rev near to node of rev near is referred to as saltorial conduction. And is a much faster way of conducting the signal along the length of the axon. Once that signal reaches the axon terminus, we have one final process we have to take into account. The axon terminus will be forming a synapse, or a small gap, with the dendrite of the postsynaptic cell. At this location, we're going to have several things we want to keep in mind. First of which is going to be secretory vesicles that are holding neurotransmitters. Over on the postsynaptic cell, you'll have receptors for those neurotransmitters. And then finally, we have a calcium voltage gated channel to think about. Okay, so let's put this in action. Step one is we're going to have our action potential rolling through. Once it comes through and reaches the axon terminus, it activates the calcium voltage gated channel. So for step two, you have the activation of calcium voltage gated channel, which takes calcium and allows it to flow into the cell. As calcium moves into the cell, it then activates snare proteins that are located on these secretory vesicles. That allows those secretory vesicles to then bind with the membrane of the axon terminus, releasing their neurotransmitters. So step three is going to be the release of the neurotransmitters. 4 is then going to be the reception of those neurotransmitters by those receptors. Once they do that, as they receive that signal, they can do one of two things. Option 1 is to allow sodium into the cell. By acting as ligand-gated sodium channels, they can go through and create a depolarization across the membrane, which we refer to as an EPSP. Option 2 would be to have the influx of something else. In other cases, such as in the GABA A receptors, in response to GABA, they'll allow chloride to enter the cell. Now, of course, that's negatively charged, which means instead of creating a depolarization, it will cause a hyperpolarization. The combination of these EPSPs and IPSPs arriving over at the axon hillock is what will determine whether or not that postsynaptic neuron will fire its action potential. And that brings us to the start. All right, guys, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this helped. Go through and practice these some more, and I'm sure that they will go through and help you learn this material better. So, till then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you later.